Greetings, fellow ghouls, and thanks for stopping by on this stormy evening. You might have noticed that I've relocated for the time being. Some might call it hiding, but, well, they'd be wrong. I'm just getting some fresh air on the grounds of my manor. In case you missed it, at the end of my last reading, I was interrupted by the Shadow Demon. Yes, that same demon I tried to vanquish this past Halloween in the Long Hallways video. It seems he's returned, more powerful than ever. And Dr. Wolfula had said that I need a brighter light source to defeat him, but I don't think I have anything like that. Oh well, I'll just keep brainstorming, I guess. Speaking of storming, there's another storm passing through right now. You've come all this way. Would you like to hear another true scary story from my collection? Yeah, I can find a good one for us. How about this one? It's called The Tale of the Creepy Canyon. Back in 2012, I went on a camping trip with a few of my closest friends. My best friend Lawrence was very into the outdoors and was always convincing the rest of us to accompany him on his crazy adventures. We had been on various camping trips over the years, making our way through a number of beautiful and remote places. That year, though, Lawrence had the idea to travel to West Texas and go to Big Bend National Park. Now, we all grew up on the East Coast, and most of our camping had been done on that side of the country, so heading out into the desert of Texas definitely felt like uncharted territory. Lawrence, however, didn't just want to go camping. He wanted the four of us to canoe down the Rio Grande and camp in the Santa Elena Canyon. It would only be a couple of days, but Lawrence assured us that it would be the most spectacular trip yet. We drove across the country with 2 canoes in tow. It was me, Lawrence, and our other 2 friends, Mark and Daryl. After getting through Texas, we spent the night at a campsite near the canyon. Nothing scary happened here, though I did have a close encounter with a scorpion that reminded me to be careful of my surroundings and watch where I was stepping. The next day we packed our canoes and ventured to the put-in point, the spot along the river where we'd embark on our journey. It was Lawrence and I in one canoe, and Mark and Daryl in the other. Lawrence had brought most of the gear, as he had more than the rest of us. He had some sort of cushy corporate job that I never quite understood, and that paid quite well and allowed him to self-fund these excursions. As such, we had an assortment of quality tents, sleeping bags, waterproof backpacks, and more. Knowing that most of the big-ticket items would be covered, I focused on the smaller essentials. This was the first time we'd gone on a trip in a desert climate, with our past get-togethers mostly in forested regions, offering some kind of shelter from the sun's rays. Conscious of this, I brought numerous bottles of sunscreen and planned to wear as many long-sleeve shirts as possible. Lawrence also warned of blisters on the hand, easily caused by the sustained paddling motion, and suggested I bring a pair of gloves to offer some kind of protection. Lastly, a wide-brimmed hat promised to keep the punishing Texas sun out of my eyes. We slid our fully packed canoes into the river, their hulls scraping the rocks of the bank. After one final push, we jumped inside. I remember it was around 9 or maybe 10 in the morning, and the sun was already decently high in the bright blue sky, beating down upon the desert with a heavy, dry heat. Honestly, though, I didn't notice the heat at first. I was too preoccupied with the view. After taking a second to get accustomed to the paddling motion and finding a proper rhythm with Lawrence, I realized how distractingly beautiful the environment was. Perhaps it was just because I'd never really seen anything like it outside of the movies, but I was truly amazed by the orange rock formations bubbling out of the sand and decorating the landscape. They reminded me of a giant version of those grow-your-own crystal kits I'd had as a child. Simple shapes that seemed to fractal into endless lines and textures. We proceeded along the Rio Grande, continuing to enjoy the scenery. The sun, however, was starting to take its toll. Even at a leisurely pace, I found the paddling to be decently demanding, again likely due to my own inexperience. As I began sweating, the generous amounts of sunscreen that I had applied to my face started to drip down into my eyes, stinging them with whatever chemicals that comprised the protective cream. I removed my sunglasses and tried to rub my eyes, but somehow this only made the pain worse. Lawrence turned around, noticing our slowing pace, and seeing that I had stopped paddling. "Come on, hurry up," he called out. "The canyon's just up ahead." I gave my tingling eyes one last rub, then looked up. Mark and Darrell were a bit ahead of us in their canoe, and beyond them lay the entrance to the canyon. I forgot to mention earlier that I had purchased a disposable camera specifically for the trip, and took a number of photographs throughout. I'll include a few here, so you can get an idea of just how awe-inspiring the landscape was, as frankly, I won't be able to do it justice with words. Here's one I took of the entrance to the canyon. As we drifted closer and closer to the towering rock formation, I heard a strange sound carrying over the water of the river. I listened intently through the sounds of our paddles splashing into the water until I could make it out clearly. It was a voice. Yes, a low voice that was singing. I followed the sound and looked up at the wall of sharp rocks towering above me. There was a man standing up at the top of the canyon entrance on the Mexico side. He was maybe middle-aged, wearing a blue shirt and strumming an acoustic guitar strapped across his shoulder. It was hard to see him so far away, but he seemed to be wearing a cowboy hat. Mark, Darrell, and Lawrence eventually noticed him too, and as we approached and got to the entrance, the man smiled and waved at us. The chords of his guitar seemed to echo off the rock walls, welcoming us into the canyon as we crossed the threshold, the Rio Grande carving a path for us through the craggy earth. The four of us waved back at the man as we continued on, enjoying his tune until we couldn't hear it any longer. We rounded a bend in the canyon, and his song grew quieter and quieter until the reverberations faded and his haunting melody slipped away into the distance. Though he had been far away and none of us spoke Spanish, I remember at the time his song feeling like a warm welcome. In retrospect, however, it may have been more of a warning. We proceeded through the canyon, stopping around midday to eat some lunch. The river was pretty calm, and navigating it, even with my lack of experience, hadn't been a problem so far. We pulled the canoes up onto the bank of the river and unpacked our food bag, putting together some sandwiches and enjoying them next to the water. While the four of us sat there in the sun, another few adventurers drifted by on their canoes and kayaks, giving us a customary wave. It was obviously a pretty remote location, but Lawrence, Mark, Darrell, and I realized that we weren't completely alone. After finishing our lunch, Lawrence told us that he had actually chosen this spot specifically for us to take a quick break. According to the map he'd found on the park's website, there was a narrow path that led through the canyon wall perpendicular to the river that offered a closer view of some of the rock formations. We made sure that our boats were far enough out of the river, grabbed our packs, and began searching for the path. We walked along the wall of the canyon, the orange rock towering above us. Lawrence studied his map, leading us to the narrow entrance, hidden by the uneven surface of the wall. I drank frequently from my water bottle, being conscious to pace myself and conserve my resources, but also feeling the heat in a big way. "Aha!" Lawrence shouted from a few paces ahead. "Here we are." The four of us gathered by the newly discovered opening, barely 10 feet wide, and weaving through the side of the canyon. The rough texture of the rock reminded me of some of those water-drip sandcastles I'd made as a child, bumpy and pockmarked. It was like someone had petrified one of those childhood creations and scaled it up a few 100%. As Lawrence, Darrell, Mark, and I navigated the twisting corridor, it started to close in on us. Though the entrance had been about 10 feet wide, there were moments where the rock jutted out and squeezed us from both sides, forcing us to shimmy along. I snapped another photo during one of these tighter moments and have attached it here. That's Darrell in front of me, squeezing through to follow the winding path. As you can see in the photo, the high rock walls and the narrow path afforded us a true luxury, our first bit of shade since the trip began. I was being pretty good about staying hydrated, but I still began to feel a bit faint as we progressed. I sat down for a moment in the shade of the rocks and told the rest of the gang to go on without me. I'd catch up with them in a second, I thought. And besides, it was just a straight, one-way path through the rock. I couldn't get lost even if I'd wanted to. Lawrence, Mark, and Daryl continued onward, leaving me to sit for a moment in the shade. I sipped on some water and waited for my head to stop spinning. Remembering my encounter with the scorpion from earlier, I double-checked my surroundings. It was just then that I noticed something strange on the ground. It took me a second to process what I was seeing. I saw the prints of our sneakers preserved in the sand, but also something else. Something that looked almost like a bare human footprint. Someone had been walking out here, likely recently, without shoes on. I clocked it in the moment, but I guess I figured it wasn't that strange. After all, we'd seen other adventurers in the canyon, so we knew we weren't totally alone. I took one final gulp of water and went to catch up with the rest of the gang. The four of us made it to the end of the narrow pathway and rejoined the main canyon, setting off once again into the Rio Grande. In a few sections of the river, the water began to move a bit faster, forcing us to do some more advanced paddling. Lawrence explained it to us, and I forget the term now, but there was even an area where a large pocket of water near some rocks was swirling in place, and easy to get stuck in. The only way to pass it was to go through, allowing the canoes to get stuck for a moment, and then paddling extra hard to emerge on the other side. As the sun dipped beyond the top of the canyon and night began its approach, I was pretty exhausted. We pulled ashore a little before sunset and set up camp by the bank of the river. There was an area of flat terrain off to the side, perfect for preparing our tents and a space to cook some food. I took another picture, this one showing the area of our campsite. You can see the flat ground, the rough canyon walls, and how nice it was to be spared by the setting sun. We cooked a few cans of food on some small burners and sat around laughing and reminiscing for a few hours. Before we knew it, it was getting dark and cold. We put on our jackets and retreated to our 2 tents, tired after a long first day and wary of having enough energy to continue the journey tomorrow. It was Lawrence and I in one tent, with Mark and Daryl in the other. Though I fell asleep quickly, I awoke maybe a few hours later and realized that I had to go to the bathroom. I could feel that it was even colder out than before, but I knew that the call of nature would not let me rest until it was answered. Trying not to disturb Lawrence, I slipped out of my sleeping bag and opened the front of our tent. I zipped the front entrance shut behind me on my way out and was instantly greeted by a rush of cold air. I instinctively reached for the headlamp in my coat pocket, and yet, as I looked out onto the canyon, I realized I didn't need it. There wasn't a cloud in the sky above, and the moon, though not quite full, was still bright enough to vaguely illuminate the area with a cold blue light. For a moment, I completely forgot about having to go to the bathroom, and just stared up at the night sky. Not just the moon, but the countless stars surrounding it. I had never seen them so bright. I walked a ways away from the tents, near where I'd taken the picture earlier, and did my business. But just as I finished and started to walk back down to the tents, I heard something. The sound of something shuffling in the sand. I turned back towards the direction of the sound, the rock wall of the canyon, but there was nothing there. I did hear what sounded like some small rocks bouncing around as I turned, though. I reached into my pocket, remembering the headlamp I hadn't needed, and powered it on, pointing it towards the canyon wall. The bright white LEDs revealed the environment in full, and there was nothing there. Oh well, I thought. The rocks likely shifted sometimes. That was probably perfectly normal. I switched off my headlamp and continued back to our tents. As I was walking, listening to the sound of my boots scuffing in the sand, I thought I heard something. Again. The sound of footsteps. footsteps echoing my own. I continued walking, but perked up my ears and subtly turned my head, focusing on the canyon behind me. It sounded like footsteps echoing my own. I stopped suddenly and swore I heard an extra step behind mine. It was like someone was following me and trying to mask their footsteps among mine. My heart racing, I took a deep breath and began walking again, almost back to our tents. Again I heard the second set of footsteps. I reached into my pocket, still walking, and prepared my headlamp. This was it, I thought. I would catch whoever was following me. I readied myself, and on the count of 3, stopped and turned, raising my headlamp and turning it on in one swift motion, half expecting to reveal someone right behind me. There was no one close, where I thought they'd be, but then I saw it. I saw a person-sized shadow duck behind a large rock in the distance. I jumped and ran back to my tent, unzipping the front and quickly re-zipping it behind me after I jumped inside. Lawrence woke up during the commotion. "What? What's going on?" He still sounded half asleep. "I think there's someone walking around out there," I said. I swear I heard footsteps." "Ugh," Lawrence groaned. "They were probably your own footsteps. Sound echoes weird in the canyon. It can make you hear things like that." Lawrence rolled over and went back to sleep. I paused for a moment. This did make some sense. Maybe it had just been my own footsteps echoing. They'd started when I walked and stopped when I stopped. The shadow I'd seen was probably just my own imagination playing tricks on me, the light from my headlamp projecting strange moving shadows onto the disorienting terrain. As I sat there mulling this over, I listened for any more footsteps coming from outside the tent, but there were none. Eventually I got back into my sleeping bag, believing Lawrence's explanation, or at least wanting to. The next morning I awoke to the sound of voices outside at our campsite. I could hear Mark, Daryl, and Lawrence talking. Looked like I was the last one to wake. I unzipped the tent and emerged. Daryl was the first to see me. "Good morning, sunshine. Check this out." My 3 companions gestured at the ground. Footprints. Dozens of footprints all throughout our campsite. Mark, Daryl, and Lawrence had noticed them as soon as they woke up, because they were bare feet. Bare footprints. I walked around, following the prints in the sand. A couple of them were right next to our tents. Lawrence told them about my adventure during the night, my claims of hearing someone walking around, now carrying a bit more weight. I then told them about what I'd seen in the narrow canyon path the day before, how I'd noticed the bare footprint when I stopped to rest. We weren't sure exactly what to make of it at the time. We had seen other adventurers out on the river, so while we knew we weren't alone, it was pretty unsettling to imagine someone so close to us in the night. Additionally, the bare footprints at our camp were especially eerie, considering that they'd been made overnight, in the cold. I had excused the one I'd found during the day as someone who'd taken off their shoes for a second, but it was harder to imagine a scenario in which someone would be barefoot at night in the canyon. Anyway, there wasn't much we could do. We continued on to the second day of our journey and had a great time, despite the uneasiness in the back of our minds. We didn't see anything strange the next day, and then exited the river before making our way back to civilization. I still think about my experience that night, alone in the moonlight, the steps I'd heard, the shadow I'd seen. The more I replayed over in my mind, the more that whoever or whatever it was seemed to have an almost playful energy, like they were just messing with me for fun. The way they followed me back to the tents before ducking behind the rocks. Though I look back on the journey fondly overall, I still wonder what happened that night in the bottom of the canyon. I'll probably never know. Another twisted tale of terror. It's like I always say, never go looking for a... I didn't know there was a phone out here. Hello?
Hey there, Guesty, it's me.
Dr. Wolfula. It's good to hear your voice.
Say, that sounded pretty loud. Are you outside?
A bit of an unfortunate turn of events. Do you remember that shadow demon? The one from last Halloween?
The one that I warned you would return, more powerful than before? What happened?
He returned, more powerful than before.
Who could have seen that coming?
I know. And so I wasn't safe any longer in the study. I've retreated out to the gazebo behind Aberfoyle. I haven't seen him out here yet.
Well, be careful. A shadow demon is a lot like a plate of bad seafood. Underestimate it now, and you'll pay for it later.
Don't I know it?
Come to think of it, I might have an idea for how to really kill this thing once and for all.
Really?
Really? It's just a hunch, but let me do some more research.
And I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Hang in there, Guesty.
I'll do my best. Well, finally, some good news. Let's hope Dr. Wolfula finds some helpful information. In the meantime, I'll keep waiting out here just to be safe. But you should go. These woods are already dangerous, and with a shadow demon wandering about... That's all for now, fellow ghouls. Do come by and see me again sometime, and I'll have another true scary story waiting for you. You know where to find me.